So, 8 Republican senators just publicly broke with Donald Trump over Canada, and Mark Carney is the reason why. Not 8 critics, not 8 moderates who have been drifting from the administration for months. 8 members of Trump's own Senate coalition, from manufacturing states, from agricultural states, from energy states, who stood on the floor of the United States Senate and said, in language that left no diplomatic ambiguity, that the administration's Canada trade policy has become economically indefensible and that they can no longer defend it to the people who sent them to Washington. They did not do this willingly. They did not do this because they wanted to. They did this because Mark Carney, the Prime Minister of Canada, made a move 4 days ago that left them no other choice. Carney announced something that the 8 senators' constituents could not absorb, could not explain away, and could not wait out. He announced the formal beginning of Canada's economic independence from the United States, complete with timelines, dollar figures, and partner agreements already signed. And when those senators read the document that came out of Ottawa, they understood something that the White House has been refusing to understand for 4 months, that the leverage had reversed, that the $760 billion trading relationship was no longer a pressure point the United States was applying to Canada. It was a pressure point Canada had just turned around. Within 48 hours of Carney's announcement, 8 of Trump's Senate allies had made calls to each other, to their state chambers of commerce, to the same industries that had been sending them letters for 4 months. And then they made the call that no Republican senator makes lightly, the one that goes public. Warren Buffett responded before the day was out. I have watched, Buffett said, strong negotiating positions become catastrophic miscalculations in the space of a single announcement. Canada just made that announcement. And the Republican senators who read it understand exactly what it means for the next 20 years. When you understand what Carney actually announced, why these 8 senators moved when they did, and what the White House said when it found out, you'll understand why career diplomats on both sides of this dispute are calling this the most consequential 48 hours of the entire trade war. Hit subscribe, because what Carney set in motion cannot be reversed by a press release. And this is unfolding in real time. Let me walk you through exactly how we got here. Because Mark Carney's announcement did not come out of nowhere. It came out of 4 months of a very specific, very deliberate Canadian calculation. And understanding that calculation is the only way to understand why 8 Republican senators did what they did this week. From the moment the 25% tariff was announced, the Canadian government made a strategic choice that most American analysts consistently misread. They read it as stubbornness, as political theater, as a government that was refusing to negotiate because its domestic politics required a show of strength. What it actually was, according to sources familiar with the Canadian government's internal deliberations, was something far more disciplined and far more dangerous. It was a government that had decided at the highest levels that the optimal response to the American tariff was not to negotiate it down. It was to use the time the dispute created to make Canada structurally less dependent on the United States than it had ever been. Carney is a specific kind of leader. He is not a politician who came up through a party machine. He is a central banker, the former governor of the Bank of Canada and the former governor of the Bank of England, who understands economic systems with the granular mechanistic precision of someone who has spent a career managing the consequences of policy decisions made by people who did not think through their systemic implications. When the tariff was announced, Carney did not experience it primarily as a political insult. He experienced it as a structural problem with a structural solution. And he began immediately and methodically building that solution. Most people in Washington don't know what happened in the 3 months before Carney's formal announcement. They don't know because it happened in procurement offices and trade ministry meetings and foreign embassy conversations that do not generate the kind of political friction that produces news coverage. What happened, according to sources familiar with the timeline, was this: Canada quietly, systematically began redirecting its institutional purchasing power. Government contracts for technology infrastructure that had historically gone to American companies began going to Canadian companies, to European companies, to companies in allied nations that were not the United States. Canadian provincial governments began reviewing energy export agreements that American partners had been treating as structurally guaranteed. And Canada's trade representatives began accelerating conversations with the European Union, Japan, South Korea, and Australia about deepening the framework agreements that already existed between those countries and Canada. None of this was announced. None of it was designed to generate a confrontation. It was designed to generate optionality, the kind of structural diversification that makes a country more capable of absorbing sustained disruption without capitulating to the source of the disruption. Meanwhile, on the American side, the Republican senators who would eventually break with Trump were receiving information from their states that the White House narrative of a working strategy was increasingly difficult to reconcile with what was actually happening to the $760 billion trade relationship. Agricultural export revenues were deteriorating in states that depend on Canadian buyers. Automotive supply chain costs were rising in manufacturing states where integrated cross-border production had been the economic backbone for decades. Energy companies in states that had been exporting to Canadian markets were reporting contract cancellations and revenue shortfalls that could not be absorbed indefinitely. For these 8 senators, the breaking point was not Carney's announcement in isolation. It was Carney's announcement landing on top of 4 months of accumulating damage that their official posture had required them to minimize and explain and contextualize, until the morning they read what Ottawa had released and realized there was no longer a context that made it explicable. The announcement came on a Wednesday, not at a press conference designed for maximum television impact. In a written document, 53 pages, released simultaneously in English and French through the official channels of the Government of Canada, that carried the title it carried without any softening: Canada's Strategic Economic Sovereignty Framework. And the room it hit hardest was not the White House press briefing room. It was 8 Senate offices in 3 time zones, where legislative directors began reading it at 6:30 in the morning and were on the phone to their senators before 7. Understand what Carney had actually released. Not rhetoric. Not a position paper. Not a diplomatic statement expressing concern and calling for dialogue. A 53-page operational document with specific timelines, specific dollar figures, specific partner agreements already signed, and specific mechanisms already authorized. The document announced $200 billion in Canadian government procurement that would be formally redirected away from American suppliers over a 5-year timeline beginning immediately, with the first tranche of contract reallocations to take effect within 90 days. It announced the formal acceleration of Canada-EU trade, deepening under the existing CETA framework, including new provisions for regulatory alignment in pharmaceutical manufacturing, aerospace components, and agricultural processing that had been specifically calibrated to replace American supply chain dependencies. It announced formal economic partnership frameworks with Japan, South Korea, and Australia that had been signed quietly without public fanfare in the preceding 8 weeks. And it announced that Canada would not be renewing 3 bilateral energy cooperation agreements with the United States that were set to expire in the coming year, affecting pipeline access arrangements, electricity export agreements, and joint grid management protocols that American utilities had been treating as structurally permanent. What the document did not do was equally significant. It did not issue demands. It did not set conditions for a return to the negotiating table. It did not frame any of its structural changes as reversible pending American concessions. This was not a counteroffer. It was an implementation plan. And that distinction between a counteroffer that invites response and an implementation plan that simply begins was not lost on a single person in those 8 Senate offices who read it that Wednesday morning. A counteroffer can be dismissed. An implementation plan that begins in 90 days cannot. The document was not angry. It was not accusatory. It did not contain the language of a government that was lashing out. It contained the language of a government that had done its homework, built its alternatives, and was now formally activating them. It was, according to one senior diplomatic source who read it that Wednesday morning, the most disciplined economic countermove I have seen from any allied government in 20 years of watching these disputes. Inside the White House, the response was a statement. Firm, brief, dismissive. The tariffs were performing as intended. Canada's announcement was a negotiating tactic, and the administration's confidence in the outcome of the strategy remained unchanged. Inside 8 Senate offices, the response was different. One senior legislative director, according to a source familiar with the conversations that morning, read the section on Energy Cooperation Agreement non-renewal and called the senator's chief of staff with a single question. How do we explain to our state's utilities that the bilateral agreements they have been planning around for the next decade are being wound down? And what do we say when they ask us what we were doing to prevent this? There was no good answer to that question. And 8 senators spent the next 24 hours discovering that there was no version of the public position they had been holding that allowed for a good answer. The break came Thursday morning. Not in unison, not coordinated according to sources, though the timing suggests a level of informal alignment that tells its own story about what the phone calls of the preceding 24 hours had produced. The first senator released a statement at 9:45. By noon, 4 more had followed. By 3 in the afternoon, 8 Republican senators had placed formal distance between themselves and the administration's Canada trade posture. Not in the cautious, hedged language of politicians trying to preserve relationships on both sides, but in the direct, unambiguous language of people who had made a calculation and were prepared to own it. The specific language one senator used has been cited more than any other in the coverage since. He said, the administration's Canada strategy was predicated on the assumption that Canada had no good alternatives to the American market. The document released by Ottawa yesterday demonstrates that assumption was incorrect and that the cost of the miscalculation will be paid by American industries, American workers, and American states, not by the administration that made it. That sentence did not come from an opponent. It came from a senator who had voted for the tariff authorization, who had defended the strategy in committee hearings, who had given speeches about the importance of confronting unfair trade practices and the necessity of leverage. He said it anyway, because Carney's 53 pages left him no other place to stand. The White House response arrived 90 minutes after the 8th senator's statement. It was, according to sources familiar with its drafting, produced under significant internal pressure and went through multiple revisions before the version that was released. The final statement characterized the senator's comments as unhelpful to the negotiating process, expressed confidence that the administration's Canada strategy would produce results, and noted that the president was aware of the senator's concerns and would be addressing them through appropriate channels. What the statement did not do was rebut any specific element of what the senators had said. It did not challenge the senator's characterization of Canada's announcement. It did not offer a timeline for resolution. It did not explain how the $200 billion procurement redirection or the energy agreement non-renewals were consistent with a strategy that was working as intended. Markets, which do not wait for White House statements to find their level, had already moved. The Canadian dollar gained against the U.S. dollar in the hour following the senator's statements, a movement that currency analysts attributed to a combined repricing of both Carney's structural announcement and the evidence that the political coalition sustaining the American tariff position had developed a visible fracture. The TSX Composite Index, the Toronto Stock Exchange benchmark, moved upward in trading that analysts described as a broad-based repricing of trade normalization probability. And in U.S. equity markets, the sectors most exposed to Canada trade disruption, automotive suppliers, agricultural processors, construction materials companies dependent on Canadian lumber. Utilities with cross-border energy arrangements saw meaningful positive movement on volume that suggested institutional investors, not retail traders, were repositioning based on a revised assessment of the dispute's trajectory. $14.2 billion a day responds to political signals before any formal policy changes. And what the market heard on Thursday was a signal it had not received in 4 months, that the political sustainability of the American trade posture had just been publicly challenged by 8 members of the coalition that sustained it, and that the document prompting the challenge had come from a Canadian government that had spent 4 months building the economic architecture necessary to make the challenge credible. The specific language of those 8 statements matters and deserves more than a quick summary. One senator from a Great Lakes manufacturing state said that her constituents had spent 4 months absorbing costs they could not pass on, watching supply chain relationships they had built over 20 years quietly redirect themselves to alternatives that did not carry a 25% premium. She said, "I supported the strategy when I believed it was producing leverage. The document released by Ottawa yesterday tells me it was producing something else." A second senator from a Midwest agricultural state said that he had received more calls from farm operators in the preceding 48 hours than in any 48-hour period in his 12 years in office. He said the calls were not angry. They were resigned. Resigned is worse than angry, he said. Angry means people still believe something can change. According to sources on the Canadian side, the reaction in Ottawa was careful, measured, and deliberate. Carney made no public statement about the senator's break with Trump. No spokesperson celebrated. No official communicated anything that could be characterized as satisfaction. The Canadian government, according to sources familiar with its posture, understood that the moment was too fragile and too important for anything that looked like a victory lap. What they had built over 4 months was structural. What the senators had said was political. The two things needed to be kept in separate registers if the possibility of a genuine resolution was to survive the moment. Warren Buffett had been watching, and what he wrote that evening in the letter that has since been distributed to every financial and political briefing room in North America explained the full economic weight of what had happened in a way that no amount of official commentary could. Warren Buffett released his letter Thursday evening. 3 pages, dense, careful, methodical, the kind of writing that you read once and then read again, because on the second reading you realize that every sentence is doing more work than it appeared to on the first. He has a specific relationship with moments like this one, moments where a political event reveals an economic reality that the political actors involved have been, for various reasons, declining to see clearly. He does not perform outrage at such moments. He describes what is actually there. And what he described on Thursday evening was more consequential than anything the official statements from either government had managed to convey. Mark Carney just did something that central bankers understand and politicians consistently underestimate, Buffett wrote. He made the cost of the status quo visible, not as a threat, not as a bluff, not as a negotiating position designed to be walked back. As a 53-page operational document with 90-day implementation timelines. When a counterparty in a dispute stops making arguments and starts making structural changes, the nature of the dispute is fundamentally shifted. You are no longer in a negotiation about price. You are in a race against irreversibility. He continued, the $760 billion trading relationship between the United States and Canada is not a figure that exists in a political speech. It is $14.2 billion moving every single day through supply chains and energy infrastructure and agricultural contracts and manufacturing agreements that were built over 6 decades and that do not rebuild in the direction of their predecessors once they have been redirected. The $200 billion procurement shift Carney announced is not a promise of future action. It is a structural commitment with a 90-day first implementation. Every day that passes without a resolution is a day that $14.2 billion finds a slightly different route. And routes, once established, develop their own institutional momentum. And then the passage that is going to be studied. In 63 years of watching the intersection of economic policy and political reality, I have observed a specific pattern that precedes the most damaging outcomes in trade disputes. The pattern looks like this. One side maintains a position long past the point where the strategic assumptions that justified the position remain valid, because the political cost of acknowledging that those assumptions were wrong exceeds, in the short term, the economic cost of maintaining the position. And then a moment arrives. It is always a specific moment, always triggered by a specific action from the counterparty, where the economic cost becomes undeniable, even to the people who have been most committed to denying it. That moment in this dispute was Wednesday morning when Canada released 53 pages that 8 Republican senators read and could not explain away. In 63 years, I have never seen that moment lead anywhere good for the side that waited for it. The verdict came at the end, not in the tone of a man who is angry, in the tone of a man who has watched the same pattern produce the same result for 6 decades and has simply run out of ways to be surprised by it. Canada, Buffett wrote, just restructured a trade relationship that the United States spent 4 months assuming it controlled. The 8 Republican senators who broke with their president today understood what that restructuring means for the $14.2 billion and the states that depend on it. The question now is whether the people with the authority to respond to that understanding are prepared to exercise it. What cascades from this moment is not a single consequence, but a compounding sequence, a set of effects that each generate their own downstream events that together constitute a structural shift in the North American economic architecture that will not be reversed by a diplomatic handshake. Begin with the most immediate economic layer. Canada's $200 billion procurement redirection is not a future threat. It is a 90-day timeline with specific contract reallocations already authorized. American companies that have been supplying Canadian government contracts in defense technology, in infrastructure, in healthcare systems, in information technology, are now operating with a formal notification that their relationship with the Canadian government is on a wind-down trajectory. The companies that replace them, Canadian companies, European companies, companies from the partner nations Carney signed framework agreements with in the preceding 8 weeks, are now beginning the implementation process. Supply chains that shift for government procurement reasons do not shift back cleanly when the political environment changes. They shift back only when the alternative is economically inferior, and Carney has spent 4 months building the case that the alternative is competitive. The energy dimension is the one that carries the longest tail. The 3 bilateral energy cooperation agreements that Canada declined to renew affect electricity transmission capacity between Ontario and the northeastern United States. Natural gas transit arrangements through Alberta that affect Midwest energy markets, and joint grid management protocols that American and Canadian utilities have been operating under for 2 decades. These are not agreements that affect the price of a commodity in a single quarter. They are the operational framework for physical energy infrastructure that serves tens of millions of American households. Renegotiating them, if they are eventually renegotiated, will take years and will happen in a diplomatic environment that Canada has now formally redesigned to its own structural advantage. The Senate fracture creates its own cascade. 8 Republican senators breaking publicly with a sitting president of their own party on a core trade policy is not, in the history of American politics, a routine event. It is a signal. It is a signal to every other Republican senator who has been holding a private position different from their public one. It is a signal to Republican governors who have been absorbing economic damage while maintaining political alignment. It is a signal to Republican donors in the industries most affected by the Canada dispute. And it is a signal to every foreign government watching how American domestic political dynamics respond to the economic consequences of American trade policy. The adversary dimension is the one that no official statement has addressed. China has been watching 4 months of the United States conduct a trade war against its closest ally and partner with the kind of patient, systematic attention that a strategic competitor devotes to every observable signal of American institutional functioning. What Beijing observed on Wednesday and Thursday is specific and material, that a sustained American trade offensive against a close ally can produce a diplomatic countermove that fractures the domestic political coalition sustaining the offensive within 48 hours, without the targeted country firing a single political shot. The targeted country simply released a 53-page document. The fracture followed as a structural consequence. That observation is being calibrated into Chinese strategic planning right now, not as a cause for celebration, as information, as data, as a variable in the calculation of how American trade policy functions under pressure from countries that are willing to absorb short-term cost to build long-term structural alternatives. Carney built something in 4 months. 8 Republican senators read it on a Thursday morning and broke with their president before noon. $14.2 billion began repricing the implications before the markets closed. And 63 years of watching the same pattern deliver the same outcome told Warren Buffett everything he needed to know. What this week has produced is not a resolution. It would be precisely wrong to characterize it that way. What it has produced is a moment of clarity, the specific kind of clarity that arrives when an economic reality that has been obscured by political positioning becomes, in the space of 53 pages, impossible to continue obscuring. The $760 billion trading relationship is not a negotiating chip. It never was. It is a structural fact about the North American economy, a fact built over 6 decades, sustained by $14.2 billion of daily commerce, and embedded in the supply chains and energy infrastructure and agricultural contracts and manufacturing agreements of a continent. It is a fact that can be damaged. It can be redirected. It can be subjected to the kind of sustained disruption that causes it to find new routes, new partners, new institutional relationships that develop their own momentum. What it cannot be is leveraged as if the damage runs in only one direction. 8 Republican senators just said that. In public, on the record. Because Mark Carney released a document that made the alternative, continued public silence in the face of evidence their own states were producing, no longer politically sustainable. Warren Buffett has watched this pattern for 63 years. He has watched strong positions become untenable ones. He has watched governments maintain postures past the point where the strategic assumptions justifying them remain valid, because the short-term political cost of acknowledging the error exceeded the short-term economic cost of sustaining it. And he has watched, in every case he can remember, the moment when a specific action by the counterparty collapsed the gap between the posture and the reality. In 63 years, he wrote, I have never seen that moment lead anywhere good for the side that waited for it. The senators did not wait. They read 53 pages on a Thursday morning and made a calculation that the economic damage to their states had crossed a threshold where the political cost of public acknowledgement was lower than the cost of continued silence. The question now is not whether that calculation was right. The question is whether the people with the authority to act on it, the people whose response to 8 senators breaking publicly with their president was a 4-sentence statement that did not rebut a single word those senators said, are prepared to close the distance between where the official position stands and where the economic reality has been for 4 months. Carney built the pressure. The senators transmitted it, the markets priced it, and the $14.2 billion that needs to move freely every single day to sustain the economic architecture that both countries depend on is waiting right now for an answer. The clock is running. And in this kind of dispute, it has always been running faster than the official statements suggest.